Welcome back, everyone, to the Risk Intel podcast, powered by SRA Watchtower, where we share risk intelligence with experts from across the banking industry. I'm your host, Ed Vincent, CEO at SRA Watchtower. Welcome back to the Risk Intel podcast. I have Josh Magri from the Cyber Risk Institute returning to the program today. Josh, thanks for coming back with us.
Thank you, Ed. And I am really glad to be asked back on this program. You never know, so I really do appreciate it. And I want to thank SRA Watchtower as well.
We're excited to have you here, and certainly a hot topic, right? With cybersecurity and cyber risk being very relevant to our audience. In our last conversation, we rewound the clock a little bit. We went back to the kind of how did we get to where we're at. We talked about the that original NIST cybersecurity framework, and then the arrival of the FFIEC CAT tool into the mix, and kind of brought forward to the current landscape where we talked about the speed at which threats are emerging and the importance to really have diligence in this area. And then I thought you did a really nice job at the end of that conversation of boiling it down into a manageable playbook, if you will, in particular for a community financial institution who doesn't have the resources of Phil Venables when he was at a Goldman or a Google Cloud, but yet he brings it back to a playbook that I think can be pretty manageable for these community financial institutions of facing the right direction. Number two, covering your basis. Number three, making it routine, and number four, making it strategic. So I'd love to use that as the jumping off point for this conversation, where we dig into a little bit about how the Cyber Risk Institute has leaned into this area. Because now, if we're facing the right direction, we're looking, as you said in our last episode, at the four options there, which are under consideration by a financial institution, and the CRI profile is one of those. So I'd love to understand a bit more about how you guys went about refining that profile, and why you think that is particularly helpful for these community financial institutions.
Great. So taking a look at those four different items again, you had the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? You have the CISA CPGs and sector-specific goals, the CRI profile, and CIS. In terms of the NIST CSF, it's multi-sectoral and it's voluntary. So it doesn't have necessarily all the components required for financial services as just a general proposition, but particularly as it relates to compliance and regulations, right? The cyber performance goals and the sector specific goals, the cyber performance goals are really kind of a great entry level set of things to do, but they do not get up to the level required of even the smallest community institution, which are the regulations from the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So CPGs aren't probably the way to go. The sector-specific goals, that's a wait and see. We'll see what comes out of CISA and Treasury. We're hopeful that they'll be coming out soon. CRI Profile essentially knit together regulatory requirements to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so back when before even CRI existed, we undertook this initiative in the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council, where we said, okay, we see the FFIEC CAT and its list of requirements. We see the NIST CSF. What if we create some almost like connective tissue between them? And the way that we did it was we used the NIST CSF almost like taxonomic structure, so you go function, category, subcategory. Then CAT had much more diagnostic statements and requirements. And so we coupled those diagnostic statements and requirements that you would also find in the IT examination handbooks and some of the other guidance and rules. and we synthesized them into what we call diagnostic statements, which are a series of control objectives. But we showed our work. So we show the flow from essentially the NIST CSF function, category, subcategory to these diagnostic statements, which then pair with the regulatory provisions. And we always adopted the idea of let's not reinvent the wheel and let's show our work. So think high school math. So that
Right.
was
Yes.
really what kind of set us apart. And when we published the first one in 2018, we did so at a National Press Club event. The regulators said really nice things about it. And at that time, it was known as the FFIEC Profile, or FSP. But they said that you're going to have to essentially create a organization, a not-for-profit, to update and maintain it. So that's exactly what happened with the Cyber Risk Institute. We developed an organization within an organization in 2020 and then spun out in 2022, and here we are. And we also were tasked with providing our stuff for free. So end users can go on our website and download not only the profile, but a series of guidebooks, etc., for free. Translations in Japanese. We're going to be having Spanish and Portuguese coming soon. And you know, the benefit of this, and why I think that the FFIEC was okay with sunsetting the CAT, was it's much harder for them to get together, collaborate, and put out new things. Whereas with our process, which is multi-stakeholder modeled really after NIST, we're able to get people to constantly look at things, and we put out major versions every 4 years or so, and minor versions every year to maybe twice a year. So we've been able to even incorporate things at a faster pace than they themselves. So when the FFIEC created the CAT, it was pegged to the IT examination handbooks that were out 10 years ago. They weren't able to update it with the new ones that had come out, whereas we've been able to update since.
So the pace of progression or evolution, if you will, of your framework stands a fighting chance of keeping up with a space that is moving at a million miles an hour, right? As we talked about in our last conversation about the speed with which threats are emerging and new vectors are arising, right? To be a big lumbering barge, if you will, going down the canal, as opposed to a speedboat, right? You don't have a chance of survival if you're that barge.
It's funny that you mentioned kind of like these like barge and speedboat, because we actually talk about it being almost like the International Space Station, where the profile acts as a docking point for all these different items. So it's flexible, it's scalable, it's adaptable. And we're seeing that pay off now with, we've been asked to do a project on AI. So we're operationalizing the NIST artificial intelligence risk management framework. And all these pieces kind of operate as like a jigsaw puzzle that can fit together or be pulled apart. The CAT
That's a great,
was
yeah,
much more of a closed system. So if you
right.
messed with one part, it kind of disrupted the whole maturity methodology, et cetera, and the types of questions that you would have to answer.
So is that why ultimately you think that the FFIEC has said, right, it's time for the CAT to be deprecated? Is that it wasn't keeping up, and it was this closed environment, if you will, whereas right in this day and age you have to be open, as you said, flexible, scalable, adaptable. I love the ISS analogy there. And it was just a situation where they felt like the paradigm has shifted, if you will.
I think that's 100% right. They've made statements similar to that fact that it was going to be quite difficult to update it given the way that it was constructed. But I mean, it did serve its purpose. You know, the regulators were able to utilize it as a data collection device and see how firms were doing across various peer groups, which is important, you know, so they could see where there were certain things that were working, certain things that weren't working, you know, which institutions might represent a bit more of a risk to the overall sector because we are interconnected, which ones were doing it well so they could pass along kind of best practices type deal, either through guidance or side conversations. So it did have its purpose. But I think there was this realization that, hey, we cannot keep pace even with our own documents, given the constraints that they have. And it is more of a closed platform that's not scalable or adaptable. So it was those plus the creation of the CRI profile, the ubiquity of NIST, and I would say really the evolution of the CIS controls from the SANS 20 that made them feel like, okay, you know, these utility type organizations, these standards development organizations are filling a space that was needed, and they're doing so at a speed which is admirable and that we can't keep pace with.
So how would you, right? The landscape shifted. There's viable, right, alternatives out there. How would you counsel a financial institution to go about evaluating, right? You talked about some of the differences in particular, right, with the the multi-sectoral aspect of the cyber of the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? The entry point, if you will, kind of level at which the CPG is operating at. But if you're a financial institution, how do you go about evaluating whether it's going to be CIS or the Cyber Risk Institute, right? How should they go about this process, and what are you counseling, and are you helping anyone, right, go through that process, or how do you direct them to evaluate option 1, 2, 3, or 4?
Sure. So we absolutely do, but of course, we have a vested interest in what it is
That's okay.
we're doing, right? So we tend to say, I think that this works very well for, but we believe it,
Yes.
We've created a whole host of items to help with the transition. So for instance, we did some mapping between the FFIEC CAT and the CRI profile. We work with organizations such as yours, and there are a number of others, whether it be, Smart Suite, Axio, X Analytics, Palo Alto, AWS, where you're able to almost put in your old CAT results and it will convert them into CRI profile results. There will be, you have to look at it and make sure that it aligns properly. There are some areas that aren't covered in the CAT that are covered in the profile, so you'll have to put those in. But we're trying to make it easy for them. But going to that pros and cons list, I've outlined, kind of the 4. NIST again, one of the things that they were missing, and we were able to get them to actually include, was that piece on governance. They were also missing a lot on third party, and we were able to get them to include that within governance. Our profile has had those things from the outset. We basically took the 5-function NIST model of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, added governance and third party, and then extended it with those diagnostic statements that were really built for financial services. And we were able to also create a scaling mechanism. So if you're a small community institution, you'd have to only do a subset, whereas if you are a large market utility or globally systemically important bank, you would have to do all the things. And so we do have a scaling device in there. What we tend to say is, going back to kind of like Phil's piece about, okay, face the right direction, cover the basics. Obviously, if you're a chief information security officer, governance risk and compliance officer, and you're coming into a situation where you've been using the cat and now you're being told to use something else, do you have the team that can do stuff that's more technical in nature? Are you
Right.
kind of more of a technical guy, or are you able to kind of provide out more of a framework for folks that some of your team can then make a bit more technical? So the reason I say that is, our CRI profile is more granular than NIST, but not so granular as CIS. So CIS has specific technical controls that they can tell you to utilize. Ours give you that International Space Station docking station to pivot to something like CIS or to the ISO or NIST 853, which are very specific sets of controls. So, what is your emergency room environment look like? Do you need like a quick fix, or can you take a breath and say, I'm going to use a framework that's going to set me up for probably some longer term initiatives, projects, and success?
Well, and that's where I was going to go with my follow-up there, was that, right, our audience here are community financial institutions for the most part. And so, thinking of that audience, having the flexibility to be able to understand where we came from, how do we map from there to here, or from here to there, and then how do we really use this as something that can drive innovation or better outcomes, rather than a check the box regulatory exercise, right? Especially at a community financial institution, those stakeholders don't have the luxury of doing the job for the sake of doing it, or checking
Right.
the box, right?
Right.
Because someone else is telling you to do it. They all need to be figuring out how to enable this institution to be competitive and innovate and survive and thrive. And so that's, I think, an interesting way to think about this, is can you use this to differentiate, to create competitive advantage, to innovate, if you will.
Yeah. And with respect to the CRI profile, we believe so, and we're doing things to essentially accomplish that on a daily, monthly, yearly basis. So, for instance, one of the things that was asked for in conversations, because you talked about my ability where I sat in the trade association world to have
Right.
conversations across different stakeholders. One of the things that we heard from cloud service providers in particular, which a lot of financial institutions utilize, not only for applications, but for platforms, was financial institutions will ask us for certain security controls. We don't know why they're asking for them. And if we can't figure it out and it doesn't correspond with our strategic plan, we're just not going to do them. And so we created a cloud extension from the profile to show the cloud service providers why it is that financial services firms are asking for certain security controls. We tied it back. And what we did is we worked with 4 of the major cloud service providers and through the Sector Coordinating Council and with the Cloud Security Alliance to not only create this, but a responsibility checklist. So now small community institutions, many of whom rely on cloud, can also download that for free and say, hey, for this control, this is going to be a shared responsibility between me, the financial institution, and the cloud service provider. And then we break it down even further and give more specific advice as to say, and here's where the baton passes, because it's very hard to share a responsibility. There's always going to be some level of baton pass. So one of the things that we've been working with AWS on is like filling that out specifically for AWS related cloud services, and we're really excited about that. So community institutions, which not only have to worry about cyber regulatory, but also kind of third-party cloud, can utilize the profile and the cloud profile to do it, and they're all interweaved and interconnected. We're also doing something on AI. We are working with MITRE, so I know a lot of folks use MITRE ATT&CK. The Center for Threat Informed Defense has put together an initiative and a project to map the profile to the various threat taxonomies. So community institutions should be able to just go, okay, these are the threats that I'm most concerned about. Here are the profile diagnostic controls that we have in place, and then here's how it's performing. And one of the things we're most excited about for SRA Watchtower, because they're really into risk management, is how do we then translate those up to risk categories and risk statements, and then board level conversations. So all of that is either out or coming out in the next year. So there's a lot there for community institutions.
And you mentioned this earlier, Josh, that part of your mandate is making this available to them, right, freely, and whether it's the profile, the guidelines, or these other materials, it seems like this is a logical starting point for them, right? If nothing else, it's a way to become educated, get smart on the topic, and certainly the fact that the regulatory environment is shifting as well, right? That's the impetus, but the reality is that if you can use these as a way to differentiate and drive innovation, then that should be a catalyst in its own right.
And I do want to talk about the shift in regulatory landscape. So the shift was underway during the Biden administration. With the Trump administration, we've seen a total recalibration. So
Yes.
The amount of examiners in the field is going to be drastically reduced. So we're foreseeing a number of things occurring as a result. I think they're going to be much more time constrained, because they're going to have to cover a broader swath of community institutions. And what do people do when they're time constrained? They do what's easiest. So you have these 4 that are suggested. My guess is the examiners are going to concentrate on those 4. And if you decide as a community institution to do something outside of those 4, I think you better socialize that well in advance with your examiner, because if you surprise them with it, I think you're going to have a tough examination.
Right.
The other piece is, given kind of this recalibration, we don't necessarily foresee the federal regulators in the United States putting out too much more in terms of either regulations, requirements, and maybe even guidance. But that means that a lot of the states may very well step in, because there's always kind of this, you squeeze the balloon on one end and what comes out kind of the side, and you'll start to see a lot of that also globally and internationally too. And so for community institutions, they say, well, why do I have to care about some of these like global regulators? We've already seen it. When the European Union put forth the GDPR, you saw California start to adopt it. So that's one thing that we also do, is we engage in conversations with regulators, not only in the United States, but outside of the United States, and we integrate things where they're integratable as well, and try to help inform those regulators as to why we think a more global approach utilizing a NIST system is probably preferable.
Well, and you mentioned this, I think, earlier, Josh, that the frequency with which you are publishing, right, those minor updates, as you called it, right, whether it's 12 or 18 months, right, you have the ability to take those global inputs and to take the fact that, right, this recalibration is occurring, and the regulatory landscape is shifting, and sounds like you're uniquely positioned to be able to bring that market dynamic into the profile in short order here, and be probably as well aligned with the new paradigm in which we're operating, as anyone, because of the speed with which you're operating.
Yeah, and the regulators have asked us to come in and do training of their examiners on the profile, its component parts, and they've also asked us to do various sessions. So there was an Ask the Fed session for community institutions where we ran through the various component parts and what we're doing and where we're going. And that was co-hosted not only by the Fed, but the Conference of State Bank Supervisors. So we're behind the scenes, we're doing a lot of work to try to train up the examiners. So that way, if you do pick the CRI profile, there's knowledge of it, there's acceptance of it, and it should be an easier venture for you.
Well, and I think that you mentioned, right, Brandon Milhorn's group there, the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, right there. There's a bent there, I think, towards innovation and really, equipping those community financial institutions to be successful. So I'm not surprised to hear them being at the forefront of wanting to understand this, right? And I think that this dynamic of training the examiners and making sure they are equipped to navigate through this journey is key. And right, the financial institutions who are listening to us here today can do their part, as you said earlier, of getting in front of your examiner, right? Having that conversation, letting them know, right, the direction you're intending to face, right? To go back to the Phil Venable's comments there, face the right direction, and communicate that, right? Make sure you have that open dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Josh, we've covered a lot of ground here. I appreciate it. I think hopefully folks who are listening now have a far better understanding as to the methodology, if you will, that CRI utilized to develop the current version of the profile, the role that it will play here going forward in the marketplace. You teased out some other topics there that I'd love to maybe tease out to our audience here, that to have you back to talk a bit about the work which CRI is doing on the artificial intelligence front. Certainly another hot and timely topic. So hopefully you'll consider rejoining us for that. But for today, we appreciate all of this great insight around the retirement of the CAT tool and the opportunity to have the CRI profile there as a what seems like a really thoughtful alternative in the marketplace.
Ed, again, thank you, and was thrilled to do this with you. And just in conclusion, if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us and ask. We're a friendly group, so
good stuff. Wonderful. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate the time. We'll look
right.
forward to having you back soon. Take care.
Thank you.